Well, truly inspiring. I think no one could have possibly better brought across what a gift it is to be alive. And there's probably no book that brings better across what an uncommonly interesting time it is to be alive than this book, The Age of Discovery, Navigating the Storms of Our Second Renaissance. Ian Goldin, the director of the Oxford Martin School and a former vice president of the World Bank, and co-author Chris Turner suggest that this is not the first time that globalization has divided societies, nor is it the first time that technological change has unleashed income inequalities, social tension, xenophobia, and ideological extremism. On the contrary, they argue that we should call our era the second Renaissance because it's marked by the same blend of wild intellectual innovation, trace, migration, and social friction seen already 500 years ago. So if you want to make sense of what is happening right now in the world, you should look back. And that's exactly what we are going to do now, as we want to learn where we are going, and how best to get there. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Ian Goldin.
Thank you very much. It's inspiring to hear Alex's wisdom, and I feel extremely humble following him, and also from Guy and Scott, who've given such incredibly profound and deep presentations. What I want to take you through is some thoughts about how the next 10, 20, 30 years may evolve, drawing on some of our past lessons. For me, this is the iconic image of our time, and it's obviously of the Berlin Wall coming down in 1989. But it's about walls coming down everywhere. It's about the things that separated us now being torn down. And the big changes that we see in the world are all because of these processes. I was living in Paris when this wall came down, working at the OECD. I'm a South African. I was born in South Africa. I was involved in the anti-apartheid struggle. And I thought I would never go back to South Africa in my lifetime. And yet, within 4 months of this wall coming down, Nelson Mandela was released from prison. He came to Paris about a year later. We met for dinner, and he asked me to be his economic advisor and to go back to South Africa to run the state bank, which I did. What I did not realize at the time, that this thing, which I thought was so particular to South Africa's history and to European history, was part of a global process of change. In fact, 65 countries became democratic within a 10-year period from that wall going down. And across Africa, Latin America, and Asia, there were massive changes. Of course, in Europe itself, there were great changes. The Maastricht Treaty, which followed soon after. The Soviet Union collapsing. The opening up of China. And so we moved from a world where there were only about 250 million people connected in the 1980s to a world today of over 6 billion connected people. Because the walls have come down, there are 2 billion more people in the world. And that's because ideas have traveled. Simple ideas, like washing your hands prevents contagious diseases, smoking kills you. And very complicated ideas, like those embedded in new vaccines, in cures for cancer, in eliminating malaria in many parts. 2 billion more people, but not only more people, more connectivity. And it's that connectivity that leads to this more rapid change. That's the reason why today is the slowest day you'll know for the rest of your lives. The pace of change is accelerating because there are more actors, more connected. And not simply more connected, more capable, more knowledgeable, released from the slums that they lived in to be part of global knowledge communities, to contribute and to learn in ways that were simply unimaginable in that pre-90s era. And so in a fundamentally different space, the cooking of ideas in the world, the number of chefs, the number of kitchens has gone from a very small number in the advanced economies of Europe, the US, Japan, to now a global endeavor. And the one thing we can be sure of in this process is much more will happen at a much more rapid pace. The one certainty is surprise. The one certainty is disruption. The one certainty is that things will come from places we never expected before. And so the great challenge for all of us, whether it's in our personal lives, whether it's in our work, whether it's with talking with those that we love, is how to make sense of this. How to make sense of this tumultuous time, because we know the past is a very poor guide to the future. There's genius emerging. There's simple, extraordinary ability of people. And that's simply because there are more people. If you believe in the random distribution of exceptional talent, there's a lot more exceptionally talented people out there. The new Mozarts, Einsteins, Shakespeares that will emerge from the streets of Shanghai, Soweto, Sao Paulo, as well as, of course, Zurich. And not only will they emerge more rapidly, but they will spread their ideas. They will be catalysts of change in ways that were unimaginable before. But we know it's not individuals that change the world. We know it's teams. We know it's people sparking off each other, people learning, like we've learned from Alex and Guy and Scott today. That's what changes the world. When you encounter ideas, physically or virtually, and they change the way you think. They change the way you go about things. And that's happening in a way that was unimaginable in the past too. And that's, again, why the pace of change is accelerating. So as innovation accelerates, we need to think, how are we going to cope when we don't know what the anchors of this are? And how do we make sense of the paradoxes? We know innovation is accelerating, but we also know that productivity is stagnating. What's going on? Why doesn't the economics reflect this extraordinary bubbling of information and knowledge? And why isn't the politics reflected? Why don't people get better when they get educated at making decisions, political decisions and others? Why were our dreams of digital knowledge so wrong? Why is it that it's not simply the case that more educated people with more information leads to better decision making? Of course, it's not simply that they're more people, but they're also more concentrated in where they are. Far from the world being more flat, as my friend Tom Friedman suggests, as a result of this process, the world is much more mountainous. Place matters more than ever. Being in the right place at the right time with the right people. That's what changes your environment and around it. And that's why the returns to being in cities are greater than ever. Now more than 80% of the world living in a major city or less than an hour away from it. And that's why we see incomes to house prices at record highs, for example. That's why we see the drive for migration being so pressured. Because getting there, wherever there is, the places of change, the dynamic cities, is more important than ever. The gulf between the dynamic places and those left behind. There are lots of ways to prove what I've been suggesting, but I'm an economist, I'm in finance, I look a lot at financial flows, and these are simply 4 of them. The top one, foreign direct investment, the green, remittances, what migrant workers send back, the black, portfolio, that's bond and equity flows, and the blue, the official flows. The simple point of this graphic is that these flows were relatively stable and flat until about 1990. Much higher orders of magnitude and much more instability in the period that followed. And that's the nature of this period. More flow, more instability. I call this process one of globalization, but it's a much abused term. I simply mean the flows across national borders of products, of goods, of services, including, of course, finance, but most importantly, the flow of ideas across national borders. That's what shapes the world. It's not simply that the flows are at much higher orders of magnitude, but so too is their complexity, because there are more and more actors. And these are simply graphics of trade flows, but you can do it for anything, to show that the number of participants in processes has grown by many orders of magnitude as more and more people have integrated. So all of our products and services, whether it's our phones, our clothes, our food, come from more and more places. And in this attribution, supply chains, cause and effect, what comes from where, whether it's an idea, a product, or a service, becomes more and more complicated. And that's why our national politicians have lost control. Because it's a complete lie if they stand up and say to you, vote for me, I can shape your future. I can protect your security. I can give you jobs. Because we know that they, as national institutions, don't control these things. They're flowing from more and more places. When we look at this time in the long sweep of the last 2,000 years, we see this most incredible story. We see income growth, that's red, the right-hand axis, exponential. We see population growth, that's green, arithmetic, the left-hand axis, both more rapid than any period in history during this period of integration. But income growth, much more rapid than population growth, which is why this is by far the best time in human history to be alive. It's by far the best time to be born in poverty because one's chances of escaping it are greater than ever in human history. It's not just the elite that have benefited. More people in more places have benefited more quickly than in any period in history, and that's why I believe in this process of integration and globalization. Average life expectancy in the world's gone up by about 20 years over this period. It took from the Stone Age to the 1980s to get that sort of average improvement in life expectancy in the world. The number of desperately poor people has gone down by about 300 million, despite the world's population going up by 2 billion. This has never happened historically. Historically, when you got rapid population growth, the number of poor people, desperately poor people, increased, even if their relative share declined. And a lot of this is to do with rising literacy. In a world of 5 billion people in 1988, only 2 billion people could read and write. In a world of 7.5 billion people today, 6.5 billion people can read and write. There are 4.5 billion more literate people in the world over this period of time. And if you believe in education and knowledge, an ability to absorb and share information as drivers of change, that combined, of course, and it's part of that process of digital connectivity, is the cause for more rapid change. Now, what I talk about in the age of discovery is there a period of time that can help us make sense of this? People talk about our time as being the fourth industrial revolution. I think, although that's true, it's not particularly helpful. Because this is very unlike the first, second, and third industrial revolutions. Those were slow processes. Indeed, there's still parts of the world where the first industrial revolution has not reached. You'll find people in parts of Asia and Africa with oxen and wooden plows being pulled by them. But those people will be on a mobile phone, have a smart device, many of them. And that's the difference. That this period of hyperconnectivity is not simply an industrial revolution, it's a social, political, and much broader one. The other thing about the previous industrial revolutions, which I think is a reason not to rely on them as a guide to the future, is that they all led to better outcomes. More jobs of higher quality replaced poorer jobs of lower quality, dirty jobs, etc. in the past. That is different to what's going on here now. Now we have very good jobs, middle-class jobs, other jobs being disintermediated, and it's far from certain, as I'll come back to, as to what will replace them. This period of change, this period of transformation, is a revolution so broad that I think the only comparable period is the Renaissance. That too was driven by an information revolution. Before that, ideas were captured by the religious orders. Handwritten manuscripts, many of them in Latin, in monasteries. Less than 1% of Europe was literate. There was very little to read and write, and it was very expensive. Now suddenly with this revolution, ideas were reproduced very quickly. Over 30 million books were printed in a 25-year period. That was exponential growth of printing in Europe, happening right around here where we are today. And in that, great challenge, because suddenly the church no longer monopolized ideas, but people, not least Luther and many others, could spread ideas. And of course the scientists did that too. The revolutions that happened in perspective, which we associate with Da Vinci, with Michelangelo and others, were simply that. They were a revolution. They changed the way people saw things. They changed human relations. They changed the way that people understood the nature of the state, of the church, and their own place in history. They saw themselves for the first time as the shapers of destiny and history, as political actors in their own right, and they demanded that they have a say. Of course, it was also about physical geography, about Europe not being the center of the world with a flat earth, but total circumnavigation within a very short period of time, Mercator's projection. With all due respect to Scott, only Australia left out by Mercator. The rest of the world was complete. And of course, we were no longer the center of the universe. There were heavens, galaxies, solar system, Copernicus and others challenging the idea that the world revolved around the earth and God. This fundamental revolution led to huge breakthroughs, which still to this day form the basis of science and many other areas. And of course, massive increases in wealth. And again, like today, geography became more important. Being in these dynamic cities, Amsterdam, Florence, and others, became more important than ever. And of course, some, like Venice, were disintermediated by the shipping. However, what we also know is it ended in total disaster. Now, I don't know if you recall those graphs of the last 2,000 years that I showed. There's no Renaissance economic boom. There was no progress in the world for most people. There were two big downsides to that Globalization 1.0 experience. The first is not only good things traveled, really bad things traveled. So the voyages of discovery that went off to the New Worlds, the Americas, for example, spread diseases that killed most Native Americans. What I call in another book, the butterfly defect of globalization, was invented then. Not only good things connect, but really bad things connect when you make these new connections. And of course, diseases came back to Europe, like syphilis, that killed many millions of Europeans. And the second great problem that emerged then was rising inequality and a perception that this period of globalization was not for ordinary people. The scribes were put out of work. Peasants had a tough time, as if you read Luther, you will read a lot about. And of course, the gold that came back from the New World went onto the ceilings of the chapels and the wealthy homes. The furs were worn by the rich, and the spices couldn't be afforded by most people. And so people said, we've lost our ethical and other anchors, and we've gained nothing. And so Savonarola and other extremists, using these new printing presses, Savonarola invented the political pamphlet, the present day's tweet. Savonarola said, the church is corrupt, the Medicis are corrupt, vote for me, I will bring you salvation. And of course, what happened was the Medicis were deposed. And that diversity, which had been absolutely central to the thriving of Florence, was abolished. Homosexuals were hung from the trees, the Muslims and Jews and others were expelled, and that was the end of that experience of Renaissance. That's why it doesn't show up. It was short-lived, and it was overthrown by extremists. And then, of course, religious wars. That spread across Europe. In my college, Balliol at Oxford University, people were killed in the corridors through these religious wars. The bonfire of the vanities represents much of this. This total rejection of intellectualism and, of course, this challenge with Luther's lectures going viral. He never anticipated that, but the new technologies allowed it. The Catholic Church pushed back. You had the Inquisitions. You had dramatic attack on intellectuals. When I read the attacks today on intellectuals, I feel the echo of this past time. The idea that the world was round, the idea that we weren't the center of the universe, was not only condemned by these fanatics, but they were, of course, the intellectuals were put in prison and hounded out. So Europe went through a period of great intolerance and extremism as a result of what I think of as this period of flourishing of ideas, of information revolutions, and of globalization. And the question, of course, today is what's happening in relation to this. And I see many parallels. While the walls have gone down between countries, within countries, they're going up everywhere. All countries experiencing rapid integration are experiencing rising inequality. And the reason is because when things change more rapidly, people get left behind more quickly. And if you don't do something about that, if you don't ensure these people left behind can get to your dynamic cities, can afford your housing, have transport systems which allow them to commute, have social security systems which will give them something to fall back on, when things change more rapidly, they start rejecting change. The second element of this is that it's very, very localized. It is not the coastal cities in the US or Chicago and other dynamic cities that voted for Trump. A tiny minority of people in these dynamic cities voted for Trump. It is not London or the south of England that voted for Brexit. It is not Paris that voted for Marine Le Pen, or Berlin, Munich, Frankfurt that voted for AfD. These people in these places are on the whole very in favor of change. They are very in favor of globalization. And that's why the narrative that people are rejecting globalization, rejecting change, I believe, is profoundly wrong. It is the people left behind that are not touched by globalization, that are not touched enough by change, that are rejecting it. Those that cannot get to the dynamic cities, those that cannot change jobs, those that cannot benefit. And so this is not a rejection of change, this is a rejection of being left out of change, and an inability to be part of the future, an inability to get on this rapidly moving train and ride with it to the next destination. And that's why we need to worry more and more about social inclusion. And it's not only income inequality, it's in all dimensions too. As Angus Deaton's shown in his brilliant work in the US, the life expectancy of white American males has gone down. The morbidity rates, the death rates have gone up while everyone else has gone down. These are the people in these forgotten cities of the Midwest, many of them turning to opioid and other addictions, who have been left out of change. And these, of course, have been the bedrock of support for Trump. The second great part of the globalization weakness today is the failure to manage systemic risk. When we connect, we don't only connect good systems, we connect very bad things. How do we have global financial systems without global financial collapse? How do we have airport hubs without them being the super spreaders of pandemics? How do we have cyber systems without them being the super spreaders of cyber attacks? How do we ensure that our openness and connectivity doesn't lead to more interdependence and vulnerability? And the answer, of course, is we can do it. But we need more cooperation, not less. And this, again, to echo something that Guy was saying, is a reason why the only way to face the future is being more connected, not less. The butterfly defect of globalization is now so rampant, is so endemic in the system, that the only way to manage our integrated system is through this. There is no wall high enough that will keep out the risks that we face, whether they're pandemics, cyber, or other. They have to be dealt with through cooperative activities. And the third great weakness of globalization is the tragedy of the commons. Can everyone climb the income curve without destroying the planet, is the key question. I'm going to come back to these. I want to race through three sets of megatrends: demographic, economic, and technological, and then come back to some of these adding up questions. I mentioned rising life expectancy. It's an incredible story. Apart from these places which are being left out, rising differentiation within countries, not between countries. Convergence between countries. Much more surprising to me has been the collapse of fertility around the world, with well over half the countries in the world, including well over half of emerging markets, now below replacement level, including, of course, Europe, dramatically so. The only uncertainty, Africa, the green line here, will it follow the rest of the world, and at what pace? So we see projections which are flattening out, Many parts of the world population's declining, and the world's population stabilizing at somewhere around 10 billion, depending, crucially, on what happens in Africa. With this, median ages double everywhere. And one of the problems with the digital native thing is that the great bulk of our conversation around future politics and dynamism is going to be this weight of the elderly in our societies, who will have the past ways of thinking and technologies embedded in their ways of thinking. Well over half the world, median age doubling over the period to 2050. Very rapid, particularly in Asia, with over 700 million people over the age of 65 within the next 7 years. So we need to remove from our mental maps ideas of population pyramids and put in place these sorts of structures, which I hope when you see them, you see a vase that you put flowers into. But because I'm an economist, I see a coffin standing up. This has many, many dramatic consequences for the future of societies. And this is very typical of Europe. The first obvious thing that jumps out of every demographic projection for every country in the world is growing gender inequality. Many more elderly women than men. And the simple reason is that they're wiser than men. They don't make as many stupid decisions. They don't smoke as much, they don't drink as much, they don't stick as many knives into each other, they don't drive as many cars into trees, and they live longer around the world. But the opposite happening at the bottom of all these projections, many more young males than females in all countries of the world, because when countries are moving towards only having 1 or maybe 2 children, and they have the technologies to choose, and the career prospects, income prospects, status of men is higher than women, and the women no longer look after you in your old age, people are choosing boys. So very skewed distributions with dramatically heavy weight of the elderly on society. Now, this has many, many economic implications. When the pensions and retirement packages were built, average life expectancy on retirement was 7 years, and average real risk-adjusted returns were 4%. That's in the 1970s. Today, average life expectancy on retirement is already 26 years, and real risk-adjusted returns are, if you invest with Leonteq, maybe 0.5% real or 5% real. But most people are getting close to zero. And in that world, the amount you have to save is 100 times greater than in the world of the 1970s for an equivalent standard of living during your old age. The combination of life expectancy and anticipated real returns, not with Leonteq, but with other average pension funds. So what happens? People save more. Obviously, they consume less. They transfer less to the next generation. The elderly hold wealth. You inherit your parents' house if you're lucky when you're 75. They don't want to pay for your college education or your housing. So the distribution between the generations gets very fraught. And, of course, you hold on to your jobs. Even if you love golf, you don't want to play golf for 25 years, and you can't afford it anyway. So you abolish retirement ages, and you work. Now, with current technologies, there's a hard limit at a mid-80s. There's a 90% chance of neurodegenerative diseases at age 90 with current technology. So that's the big issue, is people over 90 and their dependents. But that's only an issue for people my age. Young people in the room, don't worry about it. That'll be fixed. This creates enormous questions for the future structure. And of course, what's happening in financial services compounds the problem. Basel III, Solvency II, these rules are compounding the problem because they are forcing the long-term saving institutions. I was on the board of a big listed savings institution. During the financial crisis, instead of buying assets, we had to sell them to have more cash on our balance sheet, and that's been compounded by Basel III and Solvency II. So what do? You hold more and more fixed income, you push the yield curve down even further, while you should be investing in private equity. Every country is unique. China, of course, one-child policy, much more skyscraper shape, big gender inequality. US, one of the healthiest structures. But this doesn't anticipate a Trump immigration law. And it's vitally important because over half the children being born in the US today are born to first and second generation immigrant parents. Immigrants are a key determinant of the future dynamism of societies in all respects. High end in terms of innovation, but also low end in terms of demographic and the ability to do many unskilled tasks. So the workforces of the world change in dramatic ways. China has 1.6 million less workers this year than last year. Real wages are likely to double in China in the next 5 years as a result of demographics and economics intersecting. India growing, Africa growing, but of course Africa is not one country. Migration becomes more and more significant, but even if migration was 10 or 20 times its current levels, it doesn't change this basic demographic story. What countries do with immigration policy will change the dynamism, though. And one of my greatest fears on Brexit is not only will the UK economy be greatly undermined by all the other links being severed with Europe, but its wrong-headed policies on immigration already are showing. I see it at Oxford University, we see it in the health service, we see it in many areas that our productivity is being dragged down. In terms of economic growth prospects, I'm incredibly optimistic. I believe that the future is likely to look a lot like the recent past. What does that mean? That means average global growth rates of over 3%. This is incredible. Remember, size matters. China growing at 6.5% on a $20 trillion economy is adding more value added every day than when it was growing at 10 or 11% on a $10 trillion economy 10 years ago. Size matters. And so when people say, yeah, China's slowing down, I think, what is your denominator and numerator? What are you looking at? And why do you think this is a bad thing? Not only is the quality of growth improving, but also, of course, the demand, the value added, the consumption is still growing at bigger volumes. So global growth at these levels is quite extraordinary. I think Europe will continue to grow at about 2%, but coming down, productivity slowdown, demographic reasons, to long-term rates at closer to 1%. The US, 2%, Japan, 0%, China, over 6%, India, 6.5%, 7%, Asia as a whole, 6.5%, Africa, 4%, Latin America, 3%. This is a good story. No reason to feel that the world is bad. I read it, the World Bank thinks it's slowing down. I don't believe that that's going to happen. Emerging markets, a bigger and bigger part of the growth story. And that's very good for two reasons. One is a bigger, stronger engines are going to pull the global growth rates up. And secondly, there's a diversification. When the US gets a cold, the rest of the world no longer gets fever because there are so many other engines. So expect higher levels of global growth and expect more stable global growth as a result of growing participation of emerging markets in the global economy, with them becoming 80% of global growth over the coming years. So these are the numbers from the latest IMF projections, and you see this extraordinary thing of high rates of growth, and you look at these numbers all the time, so I won't go through them. When you compound these numbers, you get very high levels of per capita income in many countries overtaking the advanced economies. Many countries of the world overtaking the UK, and its ranking rapidly declining in this process. In this, the consumption bundles change dramatically. Of course, per capita depends on both income and demographic. Because there's no growth in population in China, all income growth goes into per capita growth. China goes well over 30,000 by 2050. India, because population growth is still about 2.7, you only go to about $10,000. Africa, with even higher population growth projected, around 2.9, you only go to $5,000. What you do on population can dramatically change these per capita numbers. The explosion of the middle class is part of this process. 4.9 billion new middle-class consumers by 2030, about 2/3 of them in Asia. So the shares of consumption of the world change dramatically. You see Asia, China, the bottom there in the dark mustard color, Above it, India, other Asia, Japan, lime green, the US, dark blue, and European Union, light blue. And you see the US becoming less and less and less significant as a global consumer over this period of time. This is one of the many, many reasons Brexit's so crazy, is that the future of Britain is east. It's Europe, which will be well over double the size of the US, and then further east, Asia. And that's for the world as a whole. Can it happen? I come back to this question of, is there enough stuff? Is there enough natural resource, atmosphere? What about climate change, etc., which I'll come back to. Let me whiz through some of the technological drivers behind this, and Scott has already touched on these issues. Now, one thing about all projections about the future is they're going to be wrong. I'm talking about the world in 10, 20, 30 years' time, and I hope we meet again and we can have a drink over how silly I was. But we need to think more about it, not less, although we know we're going to be wrong even more often because we're saying the world is changing more rapidly and becoming more complex. That means we're going to be wrong more often. But let's hope we get some structural drivers right, that we can make the big crossroads decisions on policy, on our lives, on our businesses, informed by the best information and by structural drivers which are less likely to be wrong. And one of these structural drivers, I believe, is the power of computing speed, the processing speed, Moore's law. Now, in the Oxford Martin School, which I've been a director of, we have over 350 academics from across 90 different disciplines in Oxford, frontiers of medicine, sciences, social sciences, and humanities, and about 45 people working on the future of computing, including a quantum computing group. And there's a lot of consensus that we're likely to see a continued doubling of processing speed for about the same price for about the next 20 years, at least. So Moore's law is not dead. That means we have somewhere between 100,000 and 1 million times the power for the same price in 20 years' time. What we don't know is what we're going to do with it. But we do know about some of the things we already can do. This is from the nanomedicine lab in the Oxford Martin School. Here we've built at the molecular level a needle about 8 billionths of a meter wide to go through an individual cancer stem cell about 5 billionths of a meter deep at a speed of 44 billionths of a second. The capacity to manage, to build at the molecular level, at the billionth of a second level, is something we already can do in the labs. Revolutionize medicine. This is from another one of the Oxford Martin labs. This is from our stem cell lab. This is the lab technician's skin turned into a heart cell. The ability to reprogram groups of cells in the body. This is happening and will come into the market in the coming decades. Even more revolutionary is what's happening in genomics. The back mouse, a wild mouse. The front mouse, a slightly genetically modified mouse, both very happy mice, I should say. The back mouse drops out after about 20 minutes, 200 meters. The front mouse goes for 2 hours, 2 kilometers. 10 times the endurance with a slight genetic modification. So what's happening in this genomics field is going to change a lot of things and raises fundamental questions, ethical questions. Who's going to have this stuff? How are they going to access it? Is it going to be a country? Is it going to be a pharmaceutical company? Is it going to be income? That's going to shape the way that these evolve and how they do things. And what's happening in the physical sphere is being amplified in the mental sphere. Cognitive enhancement, other things which will change the way we understand and our abilities in the world. The rewriting of genomics, the ability to rewrite in embryo the codes of our babies, is a fundamental question that groups like the European Union, which are the most advanced, are only beginning to grapple with, but raise fundamental questions which all countries of the world will have to deal with. And this isn't advancing at exponential speed, this is advancing at super exponential speed. Craig Venter, that's on my board, did the first human genome for $3 billion. It took him 10 years in the 1980s. The same process can be done today in 20 minutes for $100 and is declining in price exponentially. So all of us should have individual DNA sequenced within the next 10 years. We should have our individual drugs printed by 3D printer for us individually, the end of generic medicine. But who's going to control that? Is it going to be Amazon? Is it going to be Merck? Who's going to control these? How will we get them? And will we only get them if we're rich enough? These are key questions which will widen or reduce inequalities in the years to come. Now, all technologies are dual use. If you listen to the Silicon Valley people, you think there's no problem an app cannot solve. I believe there's no problem an app cannot cause as well. How these technologies, how these platforms are used becomes crucial. The engagement, the understanding of society, the regulatory environments, the choices individuals have, that becomes more and more important. And we see with all technologies the potential for immense harm and immense good. This genomics is going to revolutionize and improve healthcare. At the same time, crazy people with crazy intentions can build it with a clean lab that now costs about $200,000, declining exponentially in price. Smallpox, Ebola, something else, measles, put it on a drone, fly it down our high streets, into our stadium, etc. This is new. What these technologies are doing, like the printing press does, like the internet, is revolutionizing ownership and control of opportunity and of risk. And we've seen this most dramatically in the financial sector, always at the forefront of change because of the amount of money invested in technological products. Barings Bank, as you know, had existed for over 200 years. It had withstood the most extraordinary political, technological, and other revolutions in the world. Suddenly, one day, the management woke up and discovered that one young kid, Nick Leeson, had destroyed them overnight playing with some new technology. It's both the individual power to break systems as well as the systemic power that we've seen in the financial crisis. The rise of piracy, the rise of the power of small groups, individuals, to destabilize systems. In this world of risk, we need to think forward and understand the world, not look backward. Throw away your logs of purple boxes, green boxes, orange boxes with little ticks, and a risk management expert coming to your board meeting and say they've spoken to everyone else and the risks are contained. Because what's going to come, of course we still worry about fire and theft and all those traditional things, is surprising and new. Contagion. We can draw risk, probability, impact curves for anything. It's the long tail. Not the Nicholas Taleb black swan, unknown long tail, but things we know about we don't understand. There's nothing unknown about climate change or a pandemic or a cyber attack. We just don't analyze it in the right way and yet put enough resource into containing it. The idea that globalization spreads risk, of course, is not a new idea. In the UK, we have this monument in Poole where we think a rat coming off a ship in an early period of globalization led to the death of perhaps half the British population. That's not new. But what's new is the spread of this and the way it happens. So the swine flu that starts in Mexico City is in 160 countries in 30 days. That's new. The super spreaders of the goods of globalization, also the bads. We've modeled the spread of this in our emerging infections group with airline traffic and shown it exactly replicates it. The super spreaders of the goods of globalization, in this case major airport hubs, also the super spreaders of the bad. Of course, in the cybersphere, we're seeing this writ large because it's instantaneous and global, because it's become the new nervous system of the world. Our interdependence is much greater. Now, as we move into the Internet of Things, as we embed these in our bodies, as we're beginning to do, as we become utterly interdependent with the cybersphere, trust and integrity in this becomes more and more significant.
I'm not perfect yet, but I will become better. Right now, I am learning about human emotions. I have a default emotion, which is to be happy. But I can be sad too.
So this is Sophia.
Or angry.
She's just one of the many robots, and some of you that are involved in tech would have seen her around, that are being developed. And a key question going forward is what can machine intelligence or robotic intelligence do that we can't do, and where will it come into the job markets? Now, we've worked a lot on this. I have a group working on the intersection of technological and economic change. You might have seen the papers by Frey and Osborne, which suggest that about 47% of US jobs are vulnerable to machine intelligence. About 40% of UK and European jobs are vulnerable. About 60% of Chinese jobs are vulnerable to machine intelligence over the next 20 years. anything that's repetitive and rules-based. And then you get 3D printing and other technologies on top of that. Well, it will change where things happen and how they happen. This is footage I shot at Elon Musk's SpaceX factory. This is one of his rocket parts in titanium printed. He prints over 60% of his rockets on site. So where things happen, how they happen, and what skills will be required is changing in dramatic ways. Now, what we see in markets, in politics, is a panic response to many of this, a desire to keep the technologies out, and some countries, indeed Germany's banned GMOs, Germany has banned nuclear power. We mustn't think that because technologies exist, they will be adopted. It's how we feel about them. And when it comes to machine intelligence and AI, that's going to become even more important. So different societies will have very different uptake levels of the extent to which jobs are done by robotics. But that will dramatically affect price and quality of service. It'll be the price of capital, not the price of labor, that determines location of these services. And so the labor competitive advantage that many developing countries have in semi-skilled work will disappear. That's a great opportunity for the advanced economies to reshore things, but of course raises fundamental questions for developing countries as to what is their development trajectory, if that middle rung of the development ladder is being removed. So in this world of intersection of machine and human intelligence, how we make our choices, anticipating the pace of scale of change becomes more and more important. Let me end with the sequence of thoughts regarding how these things add up and the problem of the commons. Now, we've known for many years that individual decision-making and collective decision-making are not the same in terms of their outcomes. I can decide to go and fish in a river, and if there are plenty of fish, I'll have a great time. I might even tell my friends about it. But if I told all of you about it, I know that will be the end of the fishing. And so how we manage scarce resources is a very old problem. And of course, is the reason why we have rules and regulations around these things. As more and more people have more and more capability and knowledge, these problems become more intense. Markets cannot provide the solution. We know that no matter how much the rhino horn is worth, the rhino won't reproduce more. What economists call inelastic supply, no response to price. And so we have to accept that as the more people climb the income curve, we're going to have more and more regulation, and this balance between governments and individuals and privacy and freedom is going to have to be rethought in dramatic new ways. This is not only true in systems like natural resources, but also, of course, in pandemics. It's fine if 200 million people take antibiotics, but if 2 billion people take them, none of them will be effective. So how do we decide who's going to have these sorts of resources? Again, more and more collective decision-making is required when we have more and more integrated, high-income consuming societies. This is can you bring the volume right down? This is the fish market in, can you bring the volume right down, please? This is the Tokyo fish market. This tuna was sold for about €1 million. That's the market's response to a scarcity of a natural resource. Of course, the tuna don't know how much they're worth. They don't reproduce more. When they're worth more and more high-tech fishermen chase the remaining tuna. So this question of allocation is going to have to be something we think more and more about and using not market tools, but also getting our governments to be more effective. This is the Aral Sea, shared by 6 countries, all doing the right thing in the short term, drawing water to feed their people, collectively, of course, a disaster. And with climate change, we have this dramatic problem at a global scale. Now, we have over 60 people in the Oxford Modern School working on this. We're absolutely convinced that it's dramatic in all respects. And of course, urgent action is needed. Urgent action that requires moving to basically a zero net carbon emissions economy. And the European Union is, again, an absolute leader in this respect with many of its faults. We've already run out of budget. Already, any plant being built last year and this year is not going to have a full life. So anyone investing in fossil fuels, rethink. These are stranded assets. There are many, many assets that will have very short lives. By 2030, we need to be dramatically down, and many of these have discount rates which bring in 30, 40, 50-year horizons, not least in the oil and gas area. But how we climb the energy curve in an ethical way, which allows the rest of the world to still climb it, requires that we in the advanced economies make even more dramatic alterations. Who's going to make these decisions? The problem is the global governance system is totally unfit for 21st century purpose. It worked to solve some problems in the past, but now there are tiny cosmetic changes. I don't think Trump would even lift the sofa. Not scaled to the pace of the world's needs. So it comes down to us as individuals. The countries are like cabins in an ocean liner, no pilot on the deck. Big actors, the European Union, China on climate, and others, need increasingly to take a role. This new change, again, is progress. We can celebrate the fact that the world is no longer run by 12 white men smoking cigars in a room, as it was after the Second World War. That is unimaginable now. New powers have risen. That's the result of the effectiveness of globalization. And in this, a new power tussle. So we're in a transition phase of global power. I'm optimistic that if we look forward 20 years, this will be resolved. But now is a dangerous time. And that makes the role of the European Union as a pivotal actor even more central in this period. We know more, but paradoxically, we are less powerful because of this power transition. The greatest institutions have demonstrated just how ineffective this leadership is. Finance within our national governments is by far the best of our national systems. Our banks pride themselves on very highly paid people with great skills. Our national central banks, our treasuries, are by far the strongest of our national institutions, and at the global level, the IMF, the BIS, and so on, are by far the best of the global institutions. Compare the IMF to the UN, it's like comparing a Rolls-Royce to an old Skoda from the previous time. A Lada. And yet, these sophisticated institutions with over 20,000 PhDs were totally blind to the financial crisis coming. The IMF famously, notoriously, totally unable to see it. What did they miss that we can, I think, get a handle on? The one is this complexity and interdependence. They were looking at national systems when it's an interdependent one. The secondly is the disconnect between the national governance and the global integration. The thirdly is a total failure to understand technological change. In this case, it was credit derivatives. Old white men like me who just didn't know what was going on in the trading rooms. The fourth, the professions compounded the problem. Short-termism, mark-to-market accounting, global MBAs, all compounding groupthink, and intuition and judgment being kicked out. This is lean management in the literature, and it's going up with globalization. So the spreading around the world of short-termism and short-term incentives. And finally, the problem was not too little data, but too much data, and a total failure of judgment. I was living in Washington at the time of the financial crisis. I was one of the many 20,000 PhDs that didn't think it would happen. And yet my cleaner in my office told me that she'd bought a second home in Miami. And I knew on her income that was simply impossible. That disconnect between using your judgment and curiosity, as Alex talked about, your sense of what's going on, the breadth of your antennae and your sense-making of it, and the substitution by groupthink and data is really what was behind the financial crisis. People look at this and say, the world's best expert system brought us the financial crisis. The professionals in the European Commission brought us the Volkswagen crisis. The audit firms brought us Enron and many other things. You guys are telling me to believe and trust professionals and experts when you've let us down so badly? I understand why people don't trust experts, because we have failed. We have not been able to deliver a sustainable, inclusive global system. Our trade rules and everything else have been inadequate. And so when you look at the pushback against globalization, when you look at this desire of people to pull out of existing arrangements, we have to understand that there's real reasons for this behind This is not ideology. People's lives are suffering. Inequality is going up. Life expectancy is going down for white American males. It is in parts of England too. And of course, we have still the effects of the global crisis. So we need to go forward with a confidence that actually we can create a better world. We can create a world where trade agreements and where everything else acts in our favor. And we have to be able to explain that there's not much choice. Because the idea of withdrawal, the idea of a Brexit, or of an isolationism and protectionism, is that somehow there's some past to go back to which is better. And of course, that's profoundly misguided. Because it's not that we're connected, like some Lego blocks that can be rebuilt into different houses. We are entangled. There is no optionality at all. There's nothing we can do to create an independent future for ourselves that will safeguard our lives, our jobs, and our kids. That can only happen by being more empathetic and understanding what's going on and working more with others around the world. And the technologies give us the ability to do this. We can now celebrate a birthday party with people on the other side of the world. We can have a means of understanding and coming together. And of course, we have a population around the world which, unlike the genius of the first Renaissance, was basically white males, is now diverse and global. There's more brain power released in the world. There's more genius released than ever in history. And if that doesn't create the options for problem solving, then I believe we're not understanding what's going on. So how do you harness this? How do you ensure, as Guy said, that we really are able to disintermediate? And what's so remarkable about Macron, of course, is using the same techniques in a way of Trump, able to create a central, positive vision of the future, using social media, totally disintermediating the institutions that people don't trust. We've also seen in the climate agreement something remarkable, which is for the first time in history, people have said, the science tells us something, we as a global community will act on it. And although we can criticize the agreement as being imperfect, etc., and we can worry about it, it's still a huge achievement in terms of historical progress for humanity, a massive milestone for humanity. So there's lots to be optimistic about. There's lots to believe that we can do in terms of being connected and working together for a better world. Now, what does this all mean for investors? What does this mean for people who want to make sense of this with others' assets? The first is this incredibly positive story. Be optimistic. This is the highest growth, the more value added today than any day in human history. If you can't make money, if you can't find good investment, it's because you're not good enough at it. That's not because it's not out there to be got. This is the best time by far in terms of the potential. Globalization has created this, but it's also the underbelly of globalization we need to worry about. It is also undoing it. It's leading to the protectionism and others. It means where it's happening is dramatically different. The geography is different. But Europe is by far the most positive growth story in the world in terms of stable democracy, in terms of thinking about these big issues, the interbalances amongst them, the genomics, the ethics, etc. Imperfect, as Guy has emphasized, but still it's going to be, I think, the place where we have thought leadership. The demographics behind this, a massive shifting story, elderly, except for Africa. And with that, increasingly different understandings of the technologies and the markets. One thing is certain, is disruption. So what do you do when you know that your plans are going to be thrown apart by unpredictable events? I believe you need to worry about the old risks, but increasingly new ones too. The response is diversification. The response is understanding how things are unrelated or uncorrelated, and geography is important in this as well. Imagine a pandemic in a major place, or a major event like Hurricane Sandy that's a bit bigger. Geography and geographical diversification, very important. Real estate plays like that, extremely significant on the upside, but not in one location. Trying to get behind the economic numbers and understanding the productivity paradox is crucial too. Why is it, if innovation is accelerating, is productivity slowing down? I've got a group working on this. We have 18 different explanations. One thing I'm absolutely clear about, it's not because productivity is slowing down. There's measurement problems. There's all sorts of issues regarding inequality. There's problems with quantitative easing have compounded about keeping alive zombie firms, credit being cheap. The tail of the economy is longer and longer and being sustained on life support more and more. When interest rates go up, we will see that tail being diminished and productivity going up. The dynamic places are where you need to look at the front end of productivity, but they are increasingly isolated from the rest of the economy. Measurement, dramatic. Most of what we pick up on our devices has no economic value. And of course, it's destroying jobs. It's destroying the camera industry, the music industry, the GPS industry, etc., etc., etc. But do we feel worse off? No, we feel better off. So this measurement issue and where the jobs are is crucial. Politicians, technology, economics colliding. And when we try and understand how things will evolve, remember the technologies are not independent of the regulatory backlashes. So trying to help societies understand new technologies, embrace them, meet this challenge of the future of jobs, which is dramatic, reskilling, location, all of these questions, and giving an optimistic vision of the future of an open, integrated society is absolutely central. So as Renaissance thinkers, doers, actors, when you look back at that previous Renaissance, what we see is that those at the forefront that we celebrate 500 years later, the Da Vinci's, the Michelangelos, the Copernicuses, and the many others, what these people saw was an integrated vision. They were not defined by their professions. They were defined by a sensitivity, a curiosity, an agility, an ability to look around and to make sense of that in ways that were revolutionary. And that's what we have to be able to do now to meet this time. If we can do that, we can rock on to a very, very happy old age. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian, for this very inspiring, insightful talk. I'd be surprised if it didn't provoke any questions, so I'll hand it over right away to the audience. Any agreements, disagreements, or any questions? Who wants to go first?
If there's no questions, that'll be the first time I think I'm going to talk when no one is provoked.
There is one.
So Ian, thanks, that was fantastic. One of the things that I've continually observed in any kind of evolution or revolution is some kind of motivating event. Now, we didn't see a whole bunch of change post the last financial crisis, but do you foresee any kind of motivational event or intersection that may, grow spark to this magic, I suppose, in the change in the future?
Yeah, there's sort of two interpretations of the way that you have dramatic changes in the world. The one is that people see a risk, like the financial crisis, and then walk away from it and change the way they are. I don't think we've seen that, and I don't think we've seen it yet. The wars did that. Particularly the Second World War really did that. But we would never wish a catastrophe of that proportion on the world. I think a pandemic is the most likely scenario that will force people to recognize that more cooperation is needed. And I think we're beginning to see it, and I think Macron and others are picking up on this in a revulsion against some of the extremism that's going on. I think if people who are basically feeling that change is good are coming together in new ways, disintermediating the old institutions, and they can do that now, I think we're seeing this wave of change. But the jury's out as to whether we can walk to the end of a cliff, see the abyss and turn around, or whether we have to be thrown off and only recognize it as we're falling or hit the ground.
Well, brief, quick, and cheap printed pamphlets were the tweets of half a millennium ago. You call what we now have a second Gutenberg moment. It's a wonderful perspective on what's happening in social media. So would you say it has been rather clever that Trump discovered Twitter first as a means to communicate with the Americans and others across the world?
Yeah, I mean, clever and is maybe not the phrase I'd use, but certainly politically very, very astute, and he's revolutionized. Whether we can go back, whether the next president, whoever they are, finds that they can live in a non-Twitter world, will be very interesting to see. But what he's also done, and there's been some great analysis of this, is he's basically made all the attention around him, because it's constant. And it's, no matter how absurd or ridiculous his tweets are, that's the news. And that pushes the agenda. He's in control of the agenda. And he's crowding out and distracting from all sorts of other agendas. So when people should be talking about something else, they're saying, have you seen Trump's tweet? And that means he's dominating the political space in a way that I think is just unprecedented. And of course, everyone flows into it. All the newspapers and everyone else are picking up and compounding this problem. So I think it's a big changing point in the way it happens. And it's the reason, of course, he became president, against the institution, against the Republican Party, against the conventional media, and it's the reason why I think he'll continue to dominate. That raises the big question, which the Democrats are debating, is do they need to do the same? Or is there a different story narrative there?
You also talked about artificial intelligence, as Scott did. I don't know if you had a chance to listen to his presentation earlier. What do you foresee? When will artificial intelligence truly be in our lives and therefore also lead to a wave of job losses?
I think it's already in our lives. I mean, every time I go on my mobile device, I'm getting bombarded with ads and things which are picking up where I am and what I'm doing and what I've been saying in my emails and all of that. That's all basically primitive AI doing that. I wear this thing which is doing all sorts of magical things with AI. More interesting is the deep learning, the ability to have independent abilities to understand rules and project. I think we're already seeing, something like supermarket checkout is already totally automatable. And bank telling is totally automatable and so on. And we've already seen dramatic job losses. But what's also interesting is that some have returned. There's still 1 million people in the US employed in supermarket checkout. Why is that? Because partly they're doing other jobs, they're security, they're customer services, they're other things, but also because there's a whole generation, mainly older people, that don't like using automated tills. So I think we will see dramatic shifts, but I think it'll be very culturally bound and place bound. I think there's all sorts of jobs. My own view is that our analysis that about a quarter of jobs are likely to be lost over the next 15 years, maybe even higher in Europe, is likely to be true. Now, a big question, which is what are the new jobs? What's the quality, the place, and the terms and conditions of the new jobs? And that's a much more difficult question.
Yeah, I was going to ask, where will the new jobs be created in your view?
I think people are over-optimistic. I think there will be, of course, many new jobs, but they'll be in different places. They'll be for people with different skills, and that is going to lead to lots of rigidities and lots of people finding that they're unemployed. And that's, of course, what we're already seeing in parts of the US and in Europe.
Let's come back to the financial industry. The 2008 financial crisis, he said, has already taught us to respect this class of threat, but we do not yet appreciate how widespread it has become. In how far? Can you further elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think we live in a sort of myopia that the financial crisis is over, we're not going to have another one. That's probably misguided. It certainly won't come from the things that the ECB and IMF are worried about, I think. Credit on balance sheets, that sort of thing, amount of capital held. It's more likely to come from a Hurricane Sandy that's too big, a pandemic in Wall Street or Canary Wharf, or something totally unrelated to the previous financial crisis. And so geography becomes more and more important in that. But it's not going to. It might not come from finance at all. You know, I think I've mentioned pandemic. I think that's way out there as a risk. Cyber, all sorts of things that could happen around the cyber world is very high. And as we move into increasingly digital finance, and we haven't talked about that in my session, but I think we're moving to blockchain-enabled. The integrity of that system and where the servers are and things becomes more and more crucial. If your servers with the unique identities are linked and in some way frozen, I think you're into another sort of fragility. So basically we don't have fixed phones and we won't have paper anymore. So the digital becomes everything in terms of all our records and knowledge.
And pandemics are among the biggest risks that we will be facing.
And anyone you speak to that knows what's going on, not only in the pandemic sphere, but in terms of intelligence spheres and things, would recognize that. And increasingly the worry there is not just the natural pandemics, which we more or less understand, but man-made, human-made, through pathogens, building of sequences.
And what development are you personally most fascinated by, or what that's coming along the way? You're looking most forward
Well, I
to?
think, and I want to end on a positive note, but I think this is the most incredible time. So we see this absolute explosion of innovation. And, not a day goes by when I'm not learning about some new thing that people are doing that's going to lead to more access, better jobs, cleaner energy, etc. So all of that is happening. I think the energy revolution is incredibly exciting. We will have clean cities. We will have probably zero-cost energy, or very close to zero cost, which will revolutionize many things as well. So that's incredibly exciting. What's happening in health is mind-blowing. I'm most worried about the advances in mental health at the moment, so let them come on quickly. But that's an incredible source of optimism. I think the income growth. I mean, I'm going to China tomorrow. This is my 34th visit. I go many times a year. I have for many years. You just see the change every time. And these places that were in dire poverty are now as sophisticated as many of our societies. And they're just engines of change. So I'm optimistic. Remember that the more people are integrated, the more they invest with each other, the more they know about it, the less likely they are to kill each other. The last thing, and this is where I think Trump gets it so wrong, the last thing China would ever want to do is destabilize the US economy. It's got $1.5 trillion of US reserves, apart from all its investments, and for the fact it's its biggest export market and many other reasons. Why would you want to destabilize it? So the more integrated you are, the more you're interdependent. That's an upside, but as I've indicated, it also leads to the downsides of interdependence.
I think I saw a question here in the third row, and then in the second. But first, lady over there.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. We've talked the whole day about how the digital world is connected and everything is happening very rapidly. I've read somewhere that in the seabed there are these cords that keep all the Internet of Things alive, and it's millions and millions of miles long, and if some party decides to interfere and cut it off, it could actually cause what happened in the UK with the hospitals and NHS. Whose responsibility do you think it is? Is it the international organization, the national, well, it's in the international sea, and therefore should it be the commercial companies looking into protecting our Internet of Things? Or I would like to hear your thoughts, please.
Yeah. It is true that there's this high dependence on these cables that go through the sea. In fact, one of the big issues at the moment is that there are a lot of Russian subs around these cables, and the big worry is that that's a big security risk. It's quite easy to destroy these cables. So that's one of the first things that would happen if there was to be real tension, is the destruction of some of these cables. The management of them, I mean, it's a NATO and other concern. So it's, in the first instance, they're contractual cables to they're owned by groups of investors. But in the second instance, they're so important that they become national security concerns and groups like NATO's responsibility. What I discuss in the butterfly defect, which is on risk management, is the need to always push the management to the lowest level. So most problems can actually be solved by very few actors at a very small number of actors levels. And sometimes they're cities, sometimes they're corporates, sometimes they're simple communities or cities. So that is a good example where cooperation is needed. But not all countries have to be involved. The key countries that are connected need to be involved. What you do about it is crucial. And of course, again, I believe diversification is part of the strategy. If you only have one cable connecting you, you're in a very weak and vulnerable position. You need lots of ways running, you need satellites and lots of other backups. That all costs money. You know, whether it's a hospital and the number of oxygen bottles and bandages you have, or it's the number of different pathways for the internet. We have to see that risk management, that resilience as an asset, not a liability. And that's a whole big discussion in the accounting profession, is how one values resilience and how one values the potential for stability. And one of my problems with the lean management literature and the MBA literature, that's all driven down. That's all liability.
What is the function of migration in your scenario?
Of migration?
Of the immigration, yeah.
I think it's vital. I don't see, you know, I'm not a believer in open borders because I think it's politically not viable. But I think we need more people and we need more management of the people. In other words, we need to know who everyone in our society is. I think a great danger for our society is undocumented people. That comes with rights and responsibilities. The rights are that people have protection, that they're treated fairly, that they get proper wages, etc. The responsibility is that they pay taxes and that they follow the laws of the country involved. So my view is that we need much stronger border controls, but we need more people. And you see it in the demographics dramatically, and you see it in Germany dramatically. The European Union is by far the most interesting experiment from a migration perspective. It's the only place in the world that pulled down migration barriers, and it's been a huge source of strength and progress for Europe. Imagine Europe without people freedom to move between countries. None of the major progress we've seen or economic growth would have happened. So I think it proves that even free movement is possible, but within countries that are converging and within areas that are. And the point that Guy made about strong external borders is absolutely right. Migration is crucial both for high-end. Just think of Silicon Valley. Try and think of an iconic firm that is not migrant-founded. I think Reid Hoffman is the only one with LinkedIn. Something like 80% of the iconic firms in Silicon Valley, immigrant-founded. Something like 60% of the patents in the US, immigrant, even though they're only 12% of the population. 60% of the new engineering and other grads, immigrant, even though they're a tiny share of the total student population. So absolutely vital to explain Silicon Valley or dynamism, and as it is in many other places. And then you get into the whole thing. I mean, how do you staff a health system, etc., without immigrants? So I think it needs a much more grown-up and big discussion.
Final question. Very last one.
So one of the changes in the world that I watched quite closely last year was a change in narrative out of the Middle East, particularly former Saudi OPEC members start talking about the end of the oil era. I mean, do you see that being a big catalyst, particularly as you see your energy thesis there around how we're going to change society in the coming years?
Yeah, I do think we have to be in a world with zero carbon, net carbon, in the 2050 space, but the transition to that is going to be mainly a gas transition. So those Middle Eastern countries that are big gas exporters will do relatively well to those that are big oil exporters, and Australia, of course, and coal, forget it. I just don't understand the deal between Australia and India. I don't think it'll happen. Coal is already, not something to invest in already. So gas has a transition. The major issues around liquefying and transport, but I think the gas I'm much more positive about. But in the medium term, yes, and I think one of the ways I've seen explained what's going on in Saudi Arabia is this, the facing up to the need to radical change of the economic structure of Saudi Arabia, and all the privilege that's gone with the oil rents.
And for more, you should all read the book. I can only
Thank
highly
you very
recommend
much.
it. The Age of Discovery. It really is a source of seemingly endless knowledge and inspiration. The FT wrote about the book. Maybe someone should send Mr. Trump a copy of it. It might yield some thought-provoking tweets. Ian Goldin, thank you very much. Please give a big hand to Professor Goldin.